We are live. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Mishnah Mastery. We are going to be starting Bava Metziah, Maseches Bava Metziah. It's a second Masechta in Seder Nezikin, and we are very, very excited. Are you guys ready? Am I getting some feedback? Yeah, the sound's clear? Okay, if the sound's clear, then I can hear myself. That's really trouble. I wonder if that's Adrian who's providing that loop. But anyway, let's get ourselves underway. We're going to put the words up on the screen. That's what I needed to do. Yeah, there was still one more thing. There we go. Everyone can see? So let's get ourselves underway then. Maseches Bava Metziah, chapter 1. We are going to be talking about finding lost objects in the first couple of chapters. And in the first chapter, we're going to be dealing with ownership. Now, fun fact, this is the first Mishnah I ever learned when I started to learn Gemara. I realized I'd probably learned Pirkei Avot before getting to Bava Metziah, but this was the first Masechta I tackled in the Gemara, going to Rabbi Tatz's shir in the JLE. So this was the first Mishnah that I ever learned, and it deals with two guys who come into the Beis Din holding an object that they have both found, and they're both claiming they found it first, and so should be entitled to full ownership of the item. And they're claiming that the other guy came and grabbed it out of their hands afterwards. So when it comes to acquiring an object, taking ownership of an object, one can pick up items and acquire it in that fashion. It's a mode of acquisition called Hagbah, in the same way that lifting up the Torah is Hagbah, so too is lifting up an item and acquiring it. So the Mishnah says that Shleim Ochazin Batalis, two guys come into the Beis Din and they are holding an item. Ze Omer Ani Mitzasiha, Veze Omer Ani Mitzasiha. The first guy comes along and he says, I found it. And the other guy comes along and says, no, I found it. Ze Omer Kulashli, Veze Omer Kulashli. The first guy comes along and says, this is entirely mine. I have full ownership of this item. And the other guy says, no, I've got full ownership of the item. Ze Yishava She'ein Lo Ba Pachos Mechetzia, Veze Yishava She'ein Lo Ba Pachos Mechetzia. So the halacha says, the Mishnah says, that what we have to make them do is swear an oath. But we have to be careful that they don't swear a false oath. We know that one of them is untrue. We know that one of them is lying, or one of them does not have the facts straight. So we can't make them swear an oath that they own it entirely, because they don't. So they to make them each swear an oath that they own at least half of it. And in so doing, we avoid any problem of making them swear a false oath. And then the Mishnah says that after they have done this, they've both sworn that they have come into the ownership of this item truthfully, fairly, and faithfully, vayachloku. So then we have to divide up the value of this garment and split the value between the two claimants. What about, however, one of them comes along and says, I have the ownership of all of it. And the other says, no, I have ownership of half of it, meaning that he agrees that they picked it up at the same time. And so they're only arguing now about half of the garment, because if they picked it up at exactly the same time and did Hagbah at exactly the same time, then he is testifying to the fact that they both own half of this garment. So the Mishnah says, Ha'omer kulasheli, the one who says it's entirely his, that he found it first, and the other guy came and grabbed it off him afterwards. Yishava she'ein lo b'pachos mishalosh shechalakim. So the amount that he can swear over is 3/4, three portions of the full ownership of the item. V'ha'omer chetzi asheli, and the one who is saying that he owns half of it, Yishava she'ein lo b'pachos merivia. He then swears that he owns no less than 1/4 of the item. And then the Mishnah says, Zen notel shlosha chalakim, v'zen notel raviyah. And then afterwards, the way in which we distribute the value of this garment, assuming everyone is telling the truth and prepared to swear on it, they then divide it up that one guy gets 3/4 of the value of the item and the other person gets 1/4 of the value of the item. And that is the first Mishnah that I ever learned. Here we go. Mishnah base. Mishnah base is going to be talking about how we can have two people claiming ownership over an animal. So when it comes to acquiring an animal, taking ownership of an animal, you can either acquire it by riding on it or by guiding it, by leading it, by pulling it along. So we've got a situation where one guy is leading the animal and the other guy has jumped on to the animal. So one person's going to claim that I was there pulling along this animal and someone came along and jumped on it and then acquired ownership, so to speak. And the other guy is going to say, no, I was sitting on the animal and all of a sudden someone came along and started pulling along the reins. So the Mishnah says in Mishnah Gimel, you've got two people who are riding on this animal. One guy is riding on it and the other guy is leading it. One says, I have full ownership of the animal. And the other says, I have full ownership of the animal. So they each have to swear that they own at least half of the animal, and then they divide the ownership, they divide the value of the animal amongst themselves. At the time when they both agree to divide the item without having to swear in court, or there are witnesses who can testify to who has ownership over the item, then you can divide up the value of the item without having to swear an oath. Mishnah Gimel. If a person was riding an animal, and he sees a short distance away, he sees an item. So the question is he going to be able to acquire just by laying eyes on the item and saying, hey, that's mine now? So the Mishnah says, go and give that item to me. Natala. If the guy takes it, and he says, actually, you know what? I want this for myself. Then the Mishnah says, Zachaba. He has acquired it by picking it up. So even though someone else saw it first, you can't acquire ownership of an item just by looking at it. But if he picks it up and he gives it to the guy who's riding the animal as he was instructed to do, so then if he was to come along and say, hey, I had it first, because he picked it up, lo maklum, he has achieved nothing and the rider is going to maintain ownership of the item. Mishnah Daled, we're going to see here that in order to acquire something halachically, you need a proper halachic acquisition. You can't just fool on an item. So Ra'a Esa Metziah v'nafal aleha, sees an item and he falls on it. Sees a nice expensive jacket and he jumps on top of it and starts cuddling it so that no one else can grab it from underneath him. So Mishnah says, someone else comes and grabs it from underneath him. The person who grabs it and picks it up is the one who actually has the ownership over it. If you were to see someone running after a lost object or found object, which it really means, or achar tzvi shavur, they're running after a crippled deer, achar gozalos shelo parchu, or running after birds which are unable to fly away, v'amar zachsali sadi. So basically, you're in your garden and there's an injured, wounded deer walking through the garden, and someone else sees it and wants to acquire ownership. So they start running after it to go and grab it. But it's on your property and you see it and you say that my property should acquire this animal for me on my behalf. So the Mishnah says, Zach salos, so then it will. But the point is, it has to be an animal or an item that can't run away at full pace. So a wounded deer or a bird that can't fly, so then your reshus, your domain, can can acquire it, but if not, then it won't. So Hayat Rats, says the Mishnah, if the deer is running Kedarka at its regular pace, or Shahayu Gozaros Mafrikin, or the birds are capable of flight, Va'amar Zachsali Sadi, and you say that your land should acquire the thing in question, Lo Amaklum, then it does absolutely nothing, has no impact whatsoever, which is interesting because I occasionally have a wounded deer. I haven't seen it for a while, but I have had a wounded deer walking through my garden. I should really now be the proud owner, shouldn't I? But there we go. I also have a lot of foxes, and I'm happy to not take ownership of those. Mishnah Hey. We're going to see here that there are certain people who can make an acquisition on your behalf because of their relationship to you. So the Mishnah says in Mishnah Hey, Metziah beno vito haktanin, if your son or your daughter, who is a child, haktanim, they're minors under the age of bar bat mitzvah, if they find an item, Metzias avdo v'shivchas haktanim, or your non-Jewish slave or your non-Jewish maidservant finds an item, Metzias ishto, your wife finds an item, hare elu shalos. So if they acquire these items on your behalf, or they acquire it for themselves, but you would have the halachic ownership of it, then they belong to you. But if your children who are adults find these items, or a Jewish slave or Jewish maidservant find it, or a person's wife who's divorced from them, even if he hasn't yet given the kasuba and actually severed the link properly, hasn't paid the value of the kasuba, these items nonetheless belong to the person who finds them. Mishnah Vav, if a person finds an IOU, then who should he give it to? So what are we talking about? So the Mishnah says, Matzah Shtari Chov, if a person finds an IOU document that says that Reuven owes Shimon a certain amount of money. So if he goes and gives it to Reuven, who owes the money, he could say, well, actually, I've already paid back the money, but he hasn't. But he's claiming that he has. If he gives it to Shimon, then if Reuven had already paid it back, then Shimon could go and claim the money again. So the point is that it's an IOU document which indicates that someone owes money, but that money could have been paid back already. And you just found the original document. So what's going to happen over here? So Matzah Shtari Chov, if a person finds an IOU document, so the Mishnah says, Yesh bahen achrayas nechasim lo yachazir. If there is a lien on the document, meaning that if Reuven doesn't have the money to pay back, then Shimon can claim from Reuven's properties. So if there is a guarantee on the loan, then he can't give it back to the creditor because Shabeis Din Nifraim Mehen, because then the Beis Din could then use that document to collect repayment, which might have already been paid back. But if there's no such guarantee on the document, then you can give it back. Because Rabbi Meir says that the court will not use it to collect repayment from the document. And the Chachamim say, whichever which way, you shouldn't return this document because it could be that the Beis Din will end up using it to collect payment, and there could be something fishy going on in this whole process, and that's why this document got left behind. Richard, you are going to ask me a question, and I can almost guarantee that I won't have a good answer for you, but go for it. You are muted currently. You are still muted. Correct. Yes. Short answer. So how have they found this legit one? I'm just going to answer and say, Go and learn the Gemara, and then you'll see. Because I can't remember a good enough answer, unfortunately. But yes, I'm also familiar with that concept that but that's why they could be up to no good, because it is an unusual circumstance in which a document like this might be found. I guess I can't remember. I remember something, but I can't remember. So there we go. Get ask a real rabbi. Mishnah Zion. Matzah gite nashim. If a person finds a get, the shichrurei avadim, or a document that frees a slave from service, or diaseke, or he finds a will, or matana v'shovarim, or he finds a gifting document or a receipt of some kind. So then the Mishnah says, you should not return these items to the one who is presumed to have lost them. Because I say, and I must be Rabbi Meir, maybe, or Rabbi Huda Nasi, because what we're saying over here is that they were written, so the get was written, but they must have changed their minds and not ended up giving those documents. I guess maybe that's the case with this IOU as well, is that if you found it, then chances are it wasn't intended to be given properly, maybe. That's certainly the case with the examples that the Mishnah brings, so maybe it doesn't apply to an IOU. But it wouldn't have been unheard of for someone to write a get and then decide to not actually hand it over. I guess you could imagine the awkward situations if you see that Reuven was intending to give Sarah a gift, so you go and find Sarah and say, "Oh, hey, I found this divorce document of yours," and she's like, "What? My husband was planning to divorce me? I had no idea. What are you talking about, Reuven? What is this?" But there we go. Always be careful. Mishnah Het. Talking about situations where you may give a document back. So matzah igros shum, if a person finds letters of evaluation, which would be an assessment of values of properties so that a loan could be paid off. The igros mazon, or a letter detailing how much financial support a person's daughter should receive. Shtare chalitza, or documents pertaining to chalitza, which would allow a woman to marry someone else. Umeyunin, or documents of refusal, which would be where a girl in a particular situation would be able to refuse to marry a particular husband, and then she would be free to marry someone else, and the Beis Din would write a document to prove that this had all gone through. Ushtari Berurin, which would have been a document in which it would detail which judges had been selected for a particular court case. Chol Ma'aseh Beis Din, or any any court enactment, anything that has come through the Beis Din, Hareza Yachazir, these can be returned to the Beis Din. Matzah b'chafisa or bidluskuma, if you were to find a document in a type of bag or in a type of pouch. So I guess over here, it's a particularly formal way of these items being stored. Or tachrich shel shtaros, or you find a roll of documents, or a guda shel shtaros, or a bundle of documents, and so these are obviously owned by someone. Then harei yachazir, then these should be returned. The kama aguda shtaros, what would be considered a bundle of documents? The shlosha kashurim zebazeh, 3 documents which have been bound together, and the reason for that is because if you were to walk around and say, "Hey everyone, I found shtaros, I found documents," so what's going to happen is someone's going to have to say, "Oh, I've lost some shtaros. And then you'll say, well, how many have you lost? And then the person may come along and say 2, because that's the minimum amount of shtaros in a plural collection of documents. And so in order to avoid that possibility, the minimum amount considered in a bundle is 3. Why it would be that a scam artist can't come along and know this and then say, oh yeah, I found 3, I'm not entirely sure, but there you go and ask Richard Gilbert or learn the Gemara. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says, Echad halova mishlosha. If he basically says that there's another way of knowing whether the documents you found have belonged to the lender or to the borrower. So he says like this: a rich person would lend to many people. So if you find a bundle of documents which all have different names on, then you know that they'll have come from the same lender. But if you find a bunch of documents and they've all got the same borrower's name on, then you're going to know that they come from the same borrower, because he's just got a lot of documents of a lot of things that he has borrowed. So the Mishnah says, Echad halova mishlosha yachazir lalova. If you find 3 documents with the borrower's name on, then give them back to the borrower. Shlosha halovin me'echad. If you find 3 documents which have all borrowed from the same individual, yachazir lamalva, then you should give them back to the lender, because that's the most likely owner of these things. Matzah ben shtarosav ve'eno yodeh mativo. If you find an IOU document amongst his own papers and he's not entirely sure what the nature of it is, it could be that it was already paid back, could be that the receipts haven't been handed over yet. He's not entirely sure where this has all come from and what the status is. Yehei munach ad sheyavo Eliyahu. Then you should put it aside until Eliyahu Hanavi comes in the time of Mashiach to clarify it for you. Im yeshe mayim simponos, but if there were receipts among this pile, so yaseh ma shebesimponos, then you should do what is stated in the receipts. So in that instance, you wouldn't have to wait for Eliyahu to come, because you'll just act based on the context and the documents that you're finding in your stash. What we learn from here, ladies and gentlemen, is one should be very, very meticulously organized with all of their paperwork and know where everything is at any given time. But Mazel Tov on completing chapter 1 of Bava Metziah. And let's deal now. Pardon me? Yes. We always know where we plan to leave things, and then we always forget, and then we always leave it in a convenient, safe space, and then forget where that was. I do that all the time. Okay, Perek Beis, chapter 2, we're going to be dealing with returning lost items, Hashavas Aveda. So the Torah tells us that if a person finds something, you're supposed to hold on to it until the person comes looking for it. And so therefore, there has to be a siman, there has to be an indicator that would make it clear who the owner is. So we're going to be exploring which items have a mitzvah of Hashavas Aveda and which items do not. So we're going to start first of all with the items that do not. These are the items that if you find them, you'll be able to keep them. So Mishnah says in Perek Beis Mishnah Aleph, Elu mitzios shelo. These are the found items which are going to belong to you. Ve'elu chayav lahachriz. And these are the ones that you're going to have to publicize having found, in the hope that the owner comes forward to collect them. Elu mitzios shelo. These are the ones that are going to be your found items. Matzah peros mefruzarim. If you find a bunch of scattered fruit. Ma'os mefruzarim. So if you find a bunch of scattered money. So you find the odd coin here or there, or the odd apple here and there. Krichos b'rishus harabim. Or you find bundles of grain, but you find them in a public area. So it's small bundles of grain. So the bundle itself is not a simon, and nobody's going to really notice it. And you find it in a public place. Ve'igule devela. Or you find a clump of pressed figs, which are going to look the same all over the place. So there's no particular obvious way of figuring out who the owner might be. Kikaros shel nachtam, or a very generic baked good that's come from the bakery. Macharozos shel dagim, or strings of fish, which are fishermen's strings, which all look the same. V'chatichos shel basar, or standard cuts of meat that you've found somewhere. The gizeit semer habaos mibidonason, or unprocessed wool, which has not had any dyeing done to it, so it just looks the same as everything else. Va'nitze pishtan, bundles of flax, which are pretty standard. Ulashonos shel argaman, and strands of purple wool. Hare elu shelo. If you find these things, they are going to belong to you. Divrei Rabbi Meir, so says Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, kol sheyesh bo shinui, if there has been any alteration made to any of these items, such that an owner might be able to come forward and say, no, I could pinpoint exactly which one it is, then chayiv lahachriz. Then you have an obligation to announce that an item has been found in the hope that the owner will come forward. Ketzad. How is this the case? What are we dealing with over here? Matzah igul ubatocha cheres. If you find a round cake of pressed figs which has got a shard of earthenware inside it, kikar ubatocha ma'os, so you've got a loaf of bread with some coins inside, then you're going to have to announce that these things have been found. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says, Kol klei ampuria eino chayiv lahachriz. Any ampuria vessels, which I have an understanding here that we're talking about anything that's brand new. I guess contextually you wouldn't be able to figure out who the owner is, but it's a brand new vessel, so there's no scratches on it. There's no way of someone coming forward and saying, oh yeah, it was mine because the handle's a bit bent out of shape or whatever it might be. So then the Mishnah says you have no obligation to make an announcement that you found it. Mishnah base. These are the things which you would have to announce. Matzah peres b'kli, you find fruit inside a vessel, or kli kamos shahu, or you find a vessel somewhere. Ma'os, which I guess could be identified. Ma'os b'kis, you find money inside a pouch, or kis kamos shahu, you find an actual wallet. Sibure peris, you find a pile of fruit which is piled in a particularly recognizable way. Sibure maos, or a pile of money. Shlosha matbaos ze'al gav ze'ah, which could be just 3 coins stacked on top of one another. Krichos birshus hayachad, or you find bundles of grain, but you find it in a private domain. Bikakaros shabalabayis, or you find some domestically baked bread. V'gizeit semer, or you find some wool which has been bought from a craftsman. Kadei yayin v'kadei shemen, you find jugs of wine or jugs of oil. All these types of items are going to bring about an obligation to announce if you find them. Obviously, that's not going to be the exhaustive list, but the principles are there, that if it's going to be something which nowadays we can turn it into any kind of other example, but anything which is unique enough that someone will be able to come forward and identify it as theirs, then you're going to have an obligation to try and get that item into the hands of the owner once again. Mishnah Gimel. Sometimes items are not even considered lost. So you find something which looks like it's been lost or abandoned, but actually it could just have been hidden there, in which case you're not taking a lost object, you are stealing. So the Mishnah says, Matzah achar gapa, if you find an item behind a fence, or achar hagader, or you find it behind a wall, gozalas mukushari. So, for example, you find some birds which have been tied together so that they can't get away, or bishvilin shabasados, or you find them on paths in fields, hareza lo yigabahen. So you can't touch them because they may have been placed there, and even though you can't be sure, even though they could be lost, nonetheless you can't take the risk. Matzah kli ba'ashpa, if you find something in a garbage heap, so it's going to depend. In mechusa, if it's covered up, lo yigabo, we have to assume that someone might have hidden it there, which people will want to do back in the day, in which case you can't touch it. In Megula, no telemachris. If you find it exposed, then you should take it, but you should announce to try and find the owner. Matzah bagal, if you find it in a pile of rubble, or bekotel yashan, or in amongst an old wall, hare elu shalom. And these things are presumed to be old and will have been lost a long time ago, and so therefore you can take ownership over them. Matzah bekotel chadash, but if you find them in a new wall, mechetzio v'lachutz, if you find it in the kind of first half of the wall, shalom, then it will belong to you. Mechetzio v'lifnim, but if you find it deeply embedded in a recess of the wall, then shel balabayit. Then we have to assume that the owner has put it there purposely. Im haya maskiro la'acherim, if the house has been rented out to others, afilu b'toch habayit harei elu shalom. So then, even if you find something inside the house and this house has been rented to other people, so then it could have been left by anyone, by any of the tenants that have been there, and therefore it's going to belong to you. Mishnah Dalad. Again, we're going to be assuming here that we can't figure out who the owner could have been. Mishnah Dalad. So, matzah b'chalas, if you find an item in a shop, hare elu shalom, then it's going to belong to you. Bein hateva v'lachen v'ni, if you find this item on the counter, on the desk, but on the side of the shopkeeper, shalchen v'ni, then the item is going to become to the shopkeeper, because presumably customers don't have access to that side of the shop. Lifnei shulchani, if you find it before the money changer on the side where people would be moving around, hare elu shalom, then it can belong to you. Bein hakisei v'lashulchani, hare elu l'shulchani. But if you find it on the money changer's side, then it's going to belong to him. Halokeach peiros mechaveiro, person who buys fruits from someone, or sheshalach lo chaveiro peiros, or he sent fruits to his friend, umatzah b'hem maros, and money is found intermingled with the produce, hare elu shalom, then it's going to belong to you. Im hayud sarurim no telemachris, but if it was bundled and therefore possibly distinguishable, then you have to take them and you have to announce that items have been found. Mishnah Hey. So to understand Mishnah Hey, we have to understand that in Parshas Ki Teitzei, the Torah tells us that if you find anything similar to a donkey, then particular halachas would apply. But the point is that it mentions an article of clothing. So the Mishnah says, Af hasimla haisa bichlal kol eileh. So the words kol eileh appear in the pasuk, and Mishnah is telling us that even a simla, let's scroll down, even the garment is going to be included in this halacha of kol eileh, the generalization of items that have to be returned. So the Mishnah asks, Lama yatzas, why does it specifically mention the simla then? And the Mishnah answers, Lahakish eleha, to be able to compare, to be able to create a way of comparison, to identify which items would be included and which items would not be included. And so since clothing typically has a siman, it's typically identifiable, it's going to be valuable to the owner, and so therefore things which are valuable, things which are important to the owner, things which are distinguishable are going to be included in the parameters of items that need to be returned. So the Mishnah says, Lo merlach, to tell us, Masim lam yuchedes shesh basiman v'yesh la tovim, just like an item of clothing is going to be unique and special, that it's going to be identifiable, and that there's going to be people who want it back. Av kol davar sheyesh basiman v'yesh la tovim chayiv lahachris. Any item which is going to be distinguishable and have a degree of value to the person who's looking for it, you have an obligation to try and get those things back. But asks the Mishnah, how hard do you have to try? So for Ad Masai Chaim Lahachris, Mishnah Vav, for how long do you have to announce and try and get this item back? So the Mishnah says, Ad Kadesh Yedu Vosh Shechena Divrei Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says it's until everyone in the area has had a chance to come. Continues the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Shalosh Regalim. Rabbi Yehuda says, you've got to keep proclaiming for 3 regalim, basically for the almost the whole year. You have to keep trying to return this object. And then after the final Chag, you've got to wait another 7 days. In order that people have got enough time to go home for a distance of up to 3 days, and then they can go back to Yerushalayim to get it back from you, and then you've got the day to be able to announce it. So you have to leave enough time for someone to be able to make it back to you, to be able to get it back. Mishnah Zayin. Amar es ha'aveda velo amar simaneha lo yitein lo. All right, we're going to be trying to prevent being done by con artists over here. So you get a guy who comes and he can state what the lost item was, but he can't state what the distinguishing marks were. So lo yiten lo, you don't have to give it to him because he could be faking. V'haramai afal pisha amar simaneha, with a reputational cheater, you should still not give it to them. Shenemar ad rosh achicha oso, because the pasuk says until your brother claims it, until you've been appropriately investigated, and expounds the Mishnah ad shetidrosh es achicha em ramaihu im eino ramai. The pasuk is telling us that you have to investigate and you have to try and determine whether the person is a swindler or not. Continues in Mishnah. Kol davar she'osa v'ochal. Any item which requires, anything that's found which can provide work for you, but also requires feeding. So the Mishnah says, Ya'asav yochal, it can do work for you, and it can eat while it's in your possession. V'davar she'ein osa v'ochal yimacher. Anything that isn't going to be working for you, but is going to be eating, then the Mishnah says you can sell it, and then return the value of the item to that person. Shneimar v'hashevoso la, because the pasuk says, and you shall return it to him, which means re'ei he'ach teshivenu la. You have to find the best way of returning it to him. So there's no imperative for you to be inconvenienced by holding on to the lost object. And if that means then that you have to sell it and return the value of the item, you would be permitted to do so. So the Mishnah says, Ma yehei b'damim, what happens to this money from the sale of the animal? Rabbi Tafan Omer yishtamesh behen. Rabbi Tafan says the person who found it may use the money. And therefore, if you end up losing that money, it's going to be your job to make sure that you can pay him back. Rabbi Akiva says, you can't use it. So you're supposed to just keep it safely, but if anything ends up happening to it, then you're not going to be obligated for the losses incurred. Mishnah Ches. Matzah Safarim. If you find scrolls, and by the way, this is basically just going to tell us that we have to take care of people's items if they are in your possession. So Matzah Safarim, if you find scrolls, Kore Bahen Achas L'Shloshim Yom, then you should read from them once in 30 days, and that will stop it from becoming moldy. And if you don't know how to read, then you should just roll them open and shut so that you can ventilate them. But you should not study something new from them, because you may end up causing it damage or giving it a bit of wear. And another person should not read it with you, as they might try and maneuver it to be able to see it better, and then you may end up ripping it or may end up ruining it. Matzaksus, if you find an item of clothing, manara achas l'shloshim yom, then you should give it a shakeout once every 30 days. And spread it out if it's needed. But you should not do this for your own sake. Klei kesef u'klei nechoshes, if you find silver items or copper items, mishtamish bahem l'tzarachan, then you should use them if it's going to enhance their quality, and it stops it from getting tarnished. So mishtamesh bahem l'tzarachan, you should use them as much as they need to be used to prevent possible damage. But you should not get them dirty. You should not stain them. Klei zahav v'klei zachuchis, glass or golden vessels, lo yiga bahen al shiavo Eliyahu. You shouldn't use them until Eliyahu has come and determined who the owner is. And the reason for that is because they're not going to tarnish if you don't use them. And so therefore, you're not doing anything advantageous to the item or to the owner by using them until they come back. Matzah sak or kupa. If you find some sack, found a sack or found a large basket, or any item that's that a person wouldn't usually take and wouldn't want to be seen in public with, then you don't need to take it, as you don't need to demean yourself to be able to return a lost item. Mishnah test, dealing with situations where it's unclear if the item is lost or not. So for an animal, it could be an animal that might typically walk on its own and often make its own way home. So asks the Mishnah, Ezohi Aveda, what is considered lost property? So the Mishnah says, Matzah chamor or para roin baderech. If you find a donkey or a cow which is grazing on the path, Ezo Aveda, that's not going to necessarily be lost property, because the owners will be nearby, they'll be aware of what's going on, and so it's not going to necessarily be a lost animal. Chamor v'cheyav hafuchim. If you find a donkey where the things that it's carrying are jumbled up and up, all over the animal. Para ratza ben akramim, where you find a cow which is running between the vineyards, which it wouldn't do normally because the ground can be quite prickly for the cow. Hare zo aveda, then you can assume that it is a lost cow or a lost donkey because it looks a certain way. And presumably it has been misplaced. Hechazira uvacha, if you give it back to the owner and it runs away again, hechazira uvacha, even if this happens multiple times, afilu arba chamish pamim, even if it happens 4 or 5 times, you still have to fulfill the mitzvah of giving it back. Shneimar hashev teshivim, you shall surely return the items. Says the Mishnah, Haya batel misela, if you have a loss of earnings while trying to return the item. So the Mishnah says, Lo yomar lo ten li sela. You should not say to the owner, give me the seller by way of compensation for my loss of earnings. Rather, the owner should give this person a wage as if he was a laborer. So it will be a smaller amount, but he should be compensated by the owner in some way. So you should you have to pay them the amount. I've got a note here. A person who wouldn't do the work if he was paid not to do it. So if you pay someone 100 quid to do the work, but you pay £50 to someone to not do the work, then you pay them the amount of money that they would accept to not do their work. That's how much the person would have to compensate. Im yesh sham based in, if there are people there that can convene a based in, which would be any 3 people, not necessarily judges, masne bifnei based in, then they can decide whether the owner should have to pay this person back. In ein sham based in, if we don't have that available, bifnei mi yasne shelo kodem. So if there's no court before whom we could make this arrangement, then he will take priority in terms of his financial interests, and he would not have to go about returning the item. He doesn't have to do it because his job is going to come first. There's no obligation to forego his earnings in order to ensure that an item gets returned. Mishnah Yud. Matzah berefes eino chayiv ba. If you found an animal in a stable, then you're not obligated to return it. But if you find the animal in a public place and it's clear that it's lost, then you do have to return it. If it was found in a cemetery, then you don't have. If you're a Kohen or a Nazir, you would not have to contaminate yourself to be able to do the mitzvah of returning the item. Im amar lo aviv hitame. If your father was to say to you, go and get yourself contaminated, or she'amar lo al tachzir, or he was to say to you, oh, don't bother giving it back, then the Mishnah says, lo yishma lo. Even though you have a mitzvah of kibbud av to listen to your father, if he is telling you to get yourself contaminated or is telling you to forego the mitzvah, you don't have to listen, because in an instant where they are telling you to do something which is against the Torah, you don't have a mitzvah to listen. Parak v'ta'an, parak v'ta'an. If you unload the burden from an animal collapsing under its weight, and then you loaded the animal again, and then you unloaded it, and then you loaded it again, afilu arba v'chamisha pa'amim, even if you have to do this multiple times, you still have to do it. Chayav, you still have to unload the burden of your friend's donkey. Shneimar azov ta'azov, you shall surely release it of its burden. Halach v'yashav lo v'amar hoil v'alecha mitzvah. So if the owner went and he sat and he said to someone, since it's a mitzvah for you to unload the burden, in retzonacha lifrok parok, if you want, you can unload the burden. So then such a person is pater, from exempt from having to do it, the mitzvah shneimar imo, because you're supposed to do this with the owner. It's not just supposed to be that the owner refuses to help and gets you to do it because it's a biblical commandment to make sure that the animal is not suffering. If he's not willing to also help, then there is no mitzvah for you to have to do it by yourself. But if the owner was old or ill, then chayav, then you would have an obligation to unload the burden from this animal. Mitzvah in the Torah lifrok. There's a mitzvah in the Torah to unload the burden from an animal. Aval lo liton, but there's no mitzvah to load the animal. Rabbi Shimon Omer. Rabbi Shimon says af liton. Rabbi Shimon says even a mitzvah to do it for free, to load the animal. Rabbi Yossi Aglila Omer. Rabbi Yossi Aglila says im haya alav yoseh al masa'o. If the animal can't handle all this weight, then ein zakuk la, then you don't have to help with it, because the owner has been negligent. Ein zakuk la, you don't have to help. Shneimar tachas masa'o masa'oi sheyachol la'amod bo. That the pasuk says that it's under its burden, which implies that it's a burden which the animal can withstand. So if it's heavier than that, if it's unable to withstand, and it's you've got the owner right there who should be doing something about it, from what I understand, then there's no imperative for you to get involved and start sorting out this animal. Mishnah Yud Aleph, our final Mishnah for tonight, prioritizing different hashavas avedos. So the Mishnah says, Avedaso va'avedas aviv. If you find your own lost item and you find the lost item of your father, Avedaso kodemes, then your item takes priority. You can go and make sure that your item is secure first. Avedaso va'avedas Rabbi. If you find your lost item or your rabbi's lost item, shelo kodemes, yours still comes first. Avedas aviv, avedas rabbi. If you find your father's item or your rebbe's item, your teacher's item, shel rabbi kodemes, then your teacher comes first. She'aviv heviu la'olam hazeh, for your father brought you into this world. V'rabbi shalimdei chachma meviu l'chai ha'olam haba. But your teacher, who has taught you Torah wisdom, is bringing you to life in the next world. V'im aviv chacham, but if your father is a teacher, is a rabbi, teacher, talmid chacham, shalku k'neged rabba, at the least the same level of your teacher, then shall aviv kodemes, then your father should take priority. Aviv v'rabba nosim masoi. If your father and your teacher are carrying burdens, maniach es shel rabba v'achar kach maniach es shel aviv, then you should first unload or lighten the load for your teacher and then for your father. So we have to appreciate that we've got competing priorities here. We've got the mitzvah of kibbud av v'em, we've got the mitzvah of kibbud harav. So who takes priority? If your father and your teacher are both held captive in prison, poda es rabba, you should first organize the redemption of your teacher. And then afterwards you should free your father. And if your father is a talmid chacham, poda es aviv, poda es rabba. Then first free your father, and afterwards you should free your Rebbe. There we go, ladies and gentlemen. Mazel tov on completing chapter 2 of Maseches Bava Metziah. And that's all for this week. We look forward to going back again next time as we try and tackle, please God, chapter 3 and chapter 4. But for now, I wish you a wonderful